Welcome to Fable Sync, where nightmares take form. Tonight, prepare yourself for a full-length horror audiobook, a tale so chilling it will echo in your mind long after the darkness fades. Step into the unknown, where every shadow hides a secret and every whisper could be your last. This is no ordinary story. It's an experience you won't soon forget. Chapter 1. The Haunting Begins. Part 1. The Arrival. The old house sat at the edge of town, its silhouette casting a long shadow under the pale light of the moon. Abigail had always thought there was something unnerving about it, even before she knew its history. She'd grown up hearing the whispers, the rumors, how no one had lived there for years, how strange things had happened to anyone who dared to stay. But now, she was standing at the front door. The real estate agent had been too eager to get rid of it, not even bothering to stay for the signing of the papers. A bargain, he'd called it. A once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Abigail glanced down at the worn-out key in her hand. The house had been abandoned for nearly 2 decades, and yet, she felt like it was waiting for her. Waiting for something she didn't understand. As she pushed open the door, it creaked loudly, as though protesting her arrival. The hallway stretched before her, dark and cold. The faint smell of mildew filled the air, but something else lingered, something sharp, almost metallic. She stepped inside, the floorboards groaning under her weight. Her flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows that seemed to move in the corners of her eyes. There was no turning back now. She made her way through the house, every step echoing off the walls, as though the place was alive, breathing, watching her. The paint on the walls was peeling, and the wallpaper that remained was torn and faded. The air was thick with the weight of silence, but Abigail felt the hum of something hidden beneath it. At the end of the hall, she found a door. The handle was cold to the touch, almost unnaturally so. As she twisted it, a sudden chill swept over her, and the door swung open with a force that made her stumble back. The room inside was unlike the rest of the house, untouched by time, as though it had been frozen in a different era. A large, old-fashioned bed with dark, heavy curtains was placed in the center, and the furniture looked expensive, but it had an odd, dusty aura. A small, ornate mirror hung on the wall above the bed, reflecting the dim light of her flashlight. She felt a shiver run down her spine as she stepped inside. There was something unsettling about the room, but she couldn't put her finger on it. The silence in here was deafening, and then she heard it. A faint, almost inaudible whisper. "Leave." The words were barely there, but they were clear enough to make her blood run cold. Abigail turned sharply, looking around the room, but she was alone. The whisper had come from nowhere and everywhere. The room seemed to close in on her, the air thickening, the temperature dropping. She took a step back, but the door behind her slammed shut with a force that rattled the entire house. Panic surged through her, and she grabbed at the door handle, but it was locked. Her heart pounded in her chest as she fumbled for her phone, only to find it dead, completely drained of power. A cold laugh echoed through the room, a low, guttural sound that seemed to come from the very walls. It was then that Abigail realized she wasn't alone. Part 2. The Presence. Abigail's breath caught in her throat as the laughter echoed around her, growing louder, more sinister with every passing second. She pressed her back against the wall, her eyes darting from corner to corner, but there was nothing to see. The shadows seemed to shift unnaturally, their movements too fluid, too deliberate to be normal. She stepped forward cautiously, her heart hammering in her chest, every instinct screaming at her to run. But the door, the only way out, remained locked. There was no escape. A sudden gust of wind swept through the room, despite the windows being shut tight. It carried with it a faint scent, something rancid, like rotting wood and damp earth. It was the smell of decay, of something that had long since been forgotten, buried, left to fester. Abigail stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the edge of the bed. Her flashlight flickered again, casting an eerie glow on the mirror above the bed. For a brief, fleeting moment, she thought she saw something, someone, standing in the reflection just behind her. She whirled around, but there was no one there. The room was empty, save for the dust, the peeling wallpaper, and the slowly growing sense of dread. The whisper came again, clearer this time, closer. "Get out." The voice was soft, barely audible, but it carried the weight of something ancient, something that had been waiting for her. Abigail's hands trembled as she reached for the door handle again, only to find it still cold, still locked. Her breathing became shallow, frantic. She couldn't think, couldn't focus. All she could hear was that voice. All she could feel was the oppressive weight of something invisible pressing down on her chest. The mirror, once dull and lifeless, began to ripple, like water disturbed by a stone. Abigail stepped back, her eyes locked on the surface. Slowly, painfully, something began to take shape in the glass. A figure, tall and thin, its face obscured by shadows. She reached for her phone again, desperate for any kind of connection, but there was nothing. The screen remained blank, the battery dead. The figure in the mirror moved, its head tilting at an unnatural angle. Abigail's stomach churned as it began to smile. Slowly, too slowly, like it was savoring her fear. She stumbled back, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The room felt like it was closing in around her, the walls growing tighter with each passing second. The figure's smile widened. "No one leaves." The voice was no longer a whisper, it was a command, a threat. Abigail's heart raced as she reached for the door again, this time with a newfound desperation. But as her fingers brushed the handle, a cold hand wrapped around her wrist, yanking her away from the door. The figure from the mirror was behind her. Part 3. The Touch of the Past. Abigail gasped, her entire body frozen in terror as the cold, clammy hand gripped her wrist. She tried to scream, but no sound escaped her throat. The air around her was suffocating, thick with the stench of decay and the oppressive weight of something ancient, something malevolent. She spun around, her flashlight shaking wildly in her hand, but the figure in the mirror was no longer there. The room was empty, except for her, and the chilling presence that seemed to fill every corner. The hand released her wrist with a sharp jerk, and she stumbled backward, nearly falling to the floor. She twisted her wrist, the cold lingering, as though the touch had seeped into her very bones. Her mind raced, her pulse hammering in her ears. What was happening? Was this some kind of twisted dream? Or was she truly trapped in a house with something evil that had been lying in wait? The mirror above the bed caught her attention again. She was drawn to it, as if some invisible force was pulling her closer, forcing her to look. She didn't want to. She didn't want to see it, but she couldn't stop herself. The surface of the mirror rippled once more, and this time, Abigail saw a flash of movement, a shadow darting across the glass. Her stomach turned. The figure that emerged wasn't human, not in the way she understood it. Its form was shifting, changing, its body a grotesque collection of elongated limbs and distorted features. Its face was a blur, like a patchwork of different people, all twisted together in an eternal scream. Eyes, mouths, and noses melted into each other, a nightmarish jumble of terror and pain. Abigail staggered back, her throat constricting as she fought to breathe. Her thoughts became jumbled, her vision blurring as the room seemed to distort around her. She wanted to look away, to run, to escape, but her feet wouldn't move. She was rooted to the spot, trapped by the sight in the mirror. And then, from the darkness of the glass, the voice returned. She didn't listen either. The words were clear now, sharp, accusatory. The voice had shifted, deepening, like the growl of something far older than she could comprehend. It was speaking to her, through her, as though it had always known her, always watched her. The mirror began to distort, stretching and warping. The figure's face cracked open, revealing a darkness that seemed to consume everything in its path. Abigail's vision flickered, and suddenly, she wasn't in the room anymore. The walls melted away, and she found herself standing in an old, forgotten hallway. The air was thick with dust, the floorboards creaking beneath her feet as if they were alive. Shadows moved in the corners of her vision, whispering her name. Abigail. Her name was a whisper, but it felt like a command. She couldn't move, couldn't speak. She was frozen in place as the hallway stretched on forever, the end lost in darkness. And then, a door appeared at the far end of the hall. It was old, its wood rotting and splintered, yet it beckoned to her, drawing her closer with an unnatural force. Abigail wanted to turn back. She wanted to escape the suffocating darkness that clung to the hall, but her feet carried her forward, step by step. As she reached the door, her hand hovered over the handle, cold and lifeless, just like everything else in this place. She hesitated, but the whisper came again, louder now, echoing off the walls. "Open it." With a trembling hand, she turned the handle, and the door creaked open, revealing nothing but blackness beyond. The moment she stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind her, and the darkness consumed her whole. The last thing she heard was the voice, now laughing, mocking her. "You should have listened." Part 4. The Abyss. Abigail's breath caught in her throat as the darkness enveloped her. The instant she stepped into the room, the air turned to sludge, heavy and thick, pressing down on her chest. She couldn't see anything, not even her own hands in front of her face. The suffocating void seemed to pulse, alive with a quiet malevolence. She reached out, but her fingers brushed against nothing but air. And then, the voice. It wasn't the same voice as before. This one was deeper, guttural, vibrating through the very ground beneath her feet. It rumbled in her ears like a distant storm, but its presence felt immediate, suffocating. "Do you see it now?" the voice asked. It wasn't a question. It was a command, an accusation. Abigail's pulse raced. She could hear her heart pounding in the dead silence of the room, and yet she could feel eyes on her, countless eyes, all watching, all waiting. "What do you want from me?" Her voice barely broke the silence, weak and tremulous, as she tried to steady her breathing. The air shifted around her, the darkness folding and unfolding like the fabric of a nightmare. Her skin prickled, goosebumps rising across her arms. The temperature had dropped, and a chill crawled up her spine. The voice whispered, colder now, almost too close. "What you want from us is the same thing we want from you." Her mind swirled with confusion. What did it mean? What did she want from it? From them? A sudden flash of light burst from nowhere, bright and blinding. Abigail squeezed her eyes shut, feeling her body recoil. When she opened them again, the darkness was gone, replaced by a sickly greenish hue, the kind of light that never seemed to come from a natural source. Her surroundings had shifted. She was no longer in the hallway or the room with the mirror. She was standing in a dilapidated church. The pews were overturned, their wood splintered, and the altar at the front of the room was covered in what looked like dark stains. Blood stains? The scent in the air was foul, like rotting meat mixed with the acrid smell of burnt incense. And there, at the altar, stood a figure. A woman, or at least what once was a woman. Her body was twisted, unnaturally long. Her arms stretched out at impossible angles, fingers gnarled and claw-like. Her face was a blurred mass of features, like something had smeared the image of a human being across the canvas of her skin. But her eyes were perfectly intact. They were locked onto Abigail, hollow and cold, the pupils black as pitch, endless voids that seemed to stare straight through her. The woman, if she could even be called that, was whispering something, her lips moving, but Abigail couldn't make out the words. It was like the sound itself was being distorted, as though the woman's voice was coming from beneath the earth. Without warning, the woman's head jerked to the side, the bones cracking like dry twigs snapping in half. And then she spoke. "You should have stayed away." The room around her seemed to pulse with those words, and the walls cracked. Cracks spread across the floor like spider webs, the ceiling groaning above her as if the entire structure was about to collapse. The woman's mouth opened impossibly wide, stretching farther than humanly possible, and a terrible sound. The sound of something ancient, something unspeakable, ripped through the church. Abigail stumbled backward, her mind reeling. She had to get out. She had to leave this place. But how? How could she escape something that wasn't even real? Was any of this real? Her legs felt like jelly, but she forced herself to move, running toward the door. The walls seemed to close in, the air thickening with every step. The woman's voice continued, low and guttural, growing louder, more insistent. You can't run from the past. Abigail reached the door, her hands shaking as she tried to pull it open. The handle wouldn't budge. She yanked harder, panic rising, but the door remained sealed shut. And then the whisper returned, louder, clearer than ever before. Leave. But it wasn't the voice of the woman anymore. It was the voice of the house. The ground beneath Abigail's feet gave way, and she was falling into the abyss, deeper and deeper, until the light was completely gone. Part 5. The Truth Revealed. Abigail awoke with a gasp, her body slamming back into reality as though she had been yanked from the edge of some unfathomable void. Her chest rose and fell in rapid succession, her breath shallow and erratic, as though she had just narrowly escaped death. But she wasn't dead. She was lying on the floor of the room, the same room she had entered earlier, the same place where everything had gone wrong. The air still smelled of mildew and decay, but the oppressive weight of the presence had lifted, and the house felt quieter. She sat up slowly, her head spinning. Was it all a dream? Was it some sort of hallucination? But as her eyes scanned the room, she knew better than to believe that. The house had changed. The mirror above the bed, once cracked and lifeless, now reflected the room in its entirety, but with one horrifying difference. There was a figure standing in the reflection. Abigail's heart stopped. The figure was her, but not the way she looked now. This version of her was pale, gaunt, eyes hollowed out in a grotesque parody of life. Her mouth stretched into a twisted smile, a smile that didn't belong to her, that couldn't belong to anyone. The mirror version of herself moved, tilting its head at an unnatural angle, just like the woman from the church. "Do you understand now?" The figure in the mirror whispered. "You cannot leave. No one leaves." A sound, sharp and horrible, ripped through the air. Abigail spun around, and standing in the doorway was the woman, or what had once been a woman, her arms extended forward, her face contorted in a silent scream. The truth crashed into Abigail's mind all at once. This was no ordinary house. It wasn't just a building. It was a prison for souls who had been bound to it for eternity, cursed to repeat their torment forever. The woman, the thing that had been the woman, was just one of many who had fallen prey to the house. One of many who had tried to escape, tried to leave, but had failed. "You were warned," the woman croaked, her voice cracking like dry leaves. "But now, you are one of us." The words hit her like a slap. Her breath quickened, panic rising in her chest. The walls closed in again, the room beginning to warp, the ceiling twisting down toward her. She ran toward the door again, but it slammed shut before her hand could touch the handle. No escape. The woman's face shifted, its features distorting as it began to laugh. It was no longer a human laugh. It was the laugh of something ancient, something monstrous, a sound that felt as though it was being pulled from the very depths of hell. "The past never leaves," the woman hissed. "It never forgets." Abigail collapsed to her knees, a sob breaking free from her throat. The house was alive with a terrible force. It was feeding on her fear, on her desperation. It was pulling her in, and she couldn't fight it. She had been brought here for a reason. She had come to the house with her own secrets, her own fears, her own darkness, and now it was feeding on those too. She could feel it crawling into her mind, twisting her thoughts. But as she sat there, trembling in the center of the room, a strange calm washed over her. She wasn't alone. Not completely. From the darkness in the corners of the room, shapes began to form. Others who had been trapped here, their faces just like hers, pale and hollow, twisted in the same horror. They had once been like her, perhaps ordinary people who had stumbled into this nightmare and never returned. They were waiting for her to accept what they already knew. There was no escape. As she looked at the reflection of herself in the mirror, Abigail understood. The house had always been here, and it would always be here, waiting. And as the figures closed in on her, their faces leaching into her consciousness, she realized that she was no longer Abigail. She was just another part of the house, another soul bound to its dark, unyielding walls. Her final scream was swallowed by the void. Chapter 2. The Unseen Terror. Part 1. The Whispering Shadows. Abigail awoke in the same room, her body aching as if she had been caught in a storm. The night's events, the strange house, the mirror, the terrible woman, felt like fragments of a nightmare. She pinched herself to make sure it was real, but the cold, oppressive air told her that it wasn't just a dream. She was still trapped here. The morning light, weak and gray, filtered through the dust-covered windows. She sat up slowly, rubbing her temples, trying to make sense of what had happened. Her thoughts were scattered, fragmented. Nothing seemed to connect. The events from the night before felt like they belonged to someone else. She looked around the room. The mirror, the bed, the wallpaper peeling in the corners. Everything seemed the same, but there was something else, something she couldn't quite place. A soft whisper reached her ears, faint but unmistakable. Abigail. She froze. The voice was not from the woman in the mirror. It was quieter, almost delicate, yet chilling. She spun around, her heart racing in her chest, but the room remained still, empty. Nothing, just the silence of the house. Then, she heard it again. Abigail, it's too late. The voice was familiar. It wasn't the woman. It was her. But it wasn't. The tone was soft, pleading, as though it were calling her from another time, another place. Her breath quickened, and she stumbled out of bed, her mind a whirlwind of fear. She could feel the walls closing in again, the suffocating presence returning. The whisper echoed through the room, moving like a shadow. It was everywhere. She rushed to the door, desperate to get out. But as her hand reached for the handle, she heard it again. This time, louder, more insistent. Leave now, Abigail. But it wasn't a warning. It was a command, a summons. And Abigail had no choice but to obey. Part 2. The Descent. The air was thick with a stifling pressure, as though the house itself were breathing, watching, waiting. Abigail's fingers trembled as she grasped the door handle. The whisper had stopped, but the silence it left behind was even worse, unnerving, suffocating. She hesitated for a moment, her heartbeat pulsing loudly in her ears. The house seemed to groan in response, the walls creaking as though alive, stretching toward her. She yanked open the door with a force that made the hinges screech in protest and stepped into the hallway. The house felt different now, as if it were no longer just a structure, but something darker. The air had changed, thicker, colder. It pressed against her skin, chilled her bones. Shadows that shouldn't have been there seemed to linger, curling around corners, watching her with unseen eyes. Abigail's breath came out in ragged gasps. Her chest felt tight, as if the house itself were closing in around her. She could hear whispers now, not the soft voice from before, but something louder, more urgent. They came from the very walls, from the floors beneath her feet, from the ceiling above. It was as if the house itself had a voice, 1,000 voices trapped in its decaying frame. Come closer. The whisper was sharp, taunting. We're waiting. Abigail felt a cold shiver crawl down her spine as her eyes flicked toward the staircase ahead. The steps seemed to stretch, elongating unnaturally, as though they were mocking her hesitation. The stairs creaked as if something heavy was shifting in the shadows, something just out of reach, watching, waiting. Against every instinct screaming in her head to turn back, she stepped forward. The air grew colder the further she went. Each step was met with an eerie echo, like a distant drumbeat in a forgotten ritual. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. They sounded like voices, human voices, but twisted, contorted, as if something had taken them and broken them into pieces. There were words Abigail couldn't make out, but there was a sharpness to them, a danger, like the sharp edges of glass scraping against her skin. Suddenly, the light flickered, then went out, plunging her into total darkness. Panic surged through Abigail. She reached into her pocket for her phone, but it was dead. The darkness seemed to grow, suffocating her, wrapping around her like a heavy blanket. She couldn't see, couldn't hear anything but the pounding of her own heart. Leave this place. The voice, now clear, was not one she recognized. It was deep, guttural, and filled with ancient malice. It seemed to come from all around her, a chorus of 1,000 voices, each one more sinister than the last. The floor beneath her feet shifted. She stumbled, her legs giving way as the ground seemed to ripple like water. She caught herself against the banister, feeling the wood splinter beneath her touch, and looked around, her eyes straining against the darkness. And then, the light returned. But what she saw made her blood run cold. At the top of the stairs stood a figure, its shape distorted, its features shifting, like a thing caught between the physical world and something far darker. Its face was a blur of motion, its eyes wide and empty, staring straight at her. Its mouth opened, wide, too wide, revealing rows of teeth too sharp, too many, its throat stretching impossibly long. The figure did not move, but Abigail could feel its presence, its hunger, its need for something. Something she could not understand. "Abigail," the figure whispered, its voice 1,000 voices in one, reverberating in her skull. "You should have stayed away." Her legs refused to move, frozen in terror. She could feel it getting closer, the temperature plummeting as the darkness around her thickened. The whispers rose, a crescendo of noise, the voices crawling into her mind, twisting her thoughts. Suddenly, the figure lunged forward. Abigail screamed, the sound lost in the overwhelming rush of air as she turned and bolted down the hallway, her feet barely touching the ground. The shadows seemed to reach for her, tendrils of darkness curling and snapping like claws. She ran, not knowing where she was going, only knowing she had to get away. But the house was alive now, every hallway stretching on forever, every door closing just as she reached for it. The walls were closing in, the air growing heavier with each passing second. Her breath came in short, shallow gasps, her lungs burning, but still, she couldn't escape. A sudden thud behind her made her turn, and for a split second, she thought she saw the figure again. Its eyes gleaming in the darkness, its mouth twisted into a grin that made her blood run cold. And then, the whispers came again. "Get out! Get out! Get out!" The words echoed through her mind, becoming a mantra, a chant that seemed to reverberate in every corner of the house. Abigail didn't know if she was running through the same hallways, or if they were changing, morphing into something new. She couldn't trust her own senses. The house was playing tricks on her, warping the world around her. And then, just as she thought she couldn't run anymore, she reached a door. It was different from the others. Older, darker, covered in carvings that looked like symbols, like runes she had never seen before. Her hand trembled as she reached for the handle, but when she touched it, the door swung open without resistance, revealing a room that felt familiar. Too familiar. A single candle burned in the center of the room, casting flickering shadows on the walls. And there, sitting in the middle of the floor, was a figure. It was a woman, but not just any woman. It was her reflection. But it wasn't just her appearance. It was her soul, her essence. The woman in the room had the same eyes, the same features, but there was something wrong with her. Something wrong with the way she looked at Abigail, as if she was no longer a person, but a hollow shell. Her eyes were empty, her face drained of all emotion, like a person who had lived for too long, seen too much. Abigail's voice caught in her throat as she took a step forward. The woman whispered, barely audible, "Abigail, you shouldn't have come." Part 3. The Reflection's Secret. The air in the room grew colder as Abigail stepped forward, drawn to the reflection of herself sitting in the center of the room. The woman, sat there in the flickering candlelight, her empty eyes locked onto Abigail's. It was as though the figure in front of her wasn't just a reflection, but something far darker, a twisted mirror of who she had been, or perhaps who she was becoming. Abigail took a step back, feeling the cold press against her skin, as if the room itself were pushing her away. Her heart thudded in her chest, louder than ever, but her body moved on its own, inching closer to the figure that mirrored her every movement. "You shouldn't have come," the woman whispered again, her voice low and raspy, like a dry wind blowing through a forgotten tomb. There was a sorrow in her words, but also a warning. A warning Abigail couldn't ignore. What are you?" Abigail's voice trembled as she spoke. Her breath came in shallow gasps, the words hanging in the air, thick and heavy. The woman in the center of the room tilted her head, a slow, deliberate movement that unnerved Abigail to her core. The grin that spread across her face was slow, too slow, as if each muscle in her face had been stretched against its will. The reflection, her reflection, looked at her with something almost sympathetic, but there was no warmth in it, only a deep, consuming darkness. "You've seen it now, haven't you?" The woman's voice rasped, as if speaking through an endless echo. "You've seen what you were never meant to." Abigail's pulse quickened, her throat tightening. She tried to look away, to move back, but her body wouldn't obey. It felt like the air itself was clinging to her, pulling her closer to the figure in the center of the room. The woman stood, her movements jerky, as if her body was not quite in sync with the world around her. As she rose, Abigail noticed the marks on her skin, etched deep, like scars that ran into her flesh, twisting and curling like vines, some black, others glowing faintly with a sickly greenish light. "Your soul is already here," the woman whispered, taking a step toward Abigail. "Trapped in this place. Trapped in me." A cold sweat broke out across Abigail's forehead as the woman's gaze pierced through her. It was like staring into the abyss. Her reflection, no longer just a reflection, but a part of something much darker, something ancient, something that had always been waiting. "No," Abigail gasped, stumbling backward. I'm not like you." The woman's lips curled into a smile. No, not a smile, a grimace, like something out of a nightmare. The flickering candlelight danced in her eyes, but there was no warmth in them, only cold, empty, endless. "Not yet," the woman said, her voice now sounding distant, as if she were speaking from miles away. "But you will be." Suddenly, the shadows in the room stretched forward, twisting, curling, as if alive. Abigail turned, her heart racing, but there was no escape. The walls were closing in. The shadows were no longer just shadows. They were fingers, reaching, grasping, pulling at her. The woman in the center of the room laughed, a hollow, echoing sound that shook the very foundation of the house. The walls groaned, the floor creaked, and the air grew thick with the scent of decay and rot. "You've seen the truth, Abigail," the woman whispered, her voice like gravel grinding together. "You are part of this house now, and there is no leaving." Abigail's breath hitched in her throat. She felt the pull of the shadows, stronger now, drawing her closer to the figure, to her own reflection, to the thing she feared most. "No," Abigail cried out, struggling, her body shaking with the weight of terror. "I won't become like you." But the woman's laughter echoed through the room, the sound hollow, mocking. She stepped forward, her feet dragging as if she were moving through some otherworldly force. The shadows at her feet writhed, growing, reaching out for Abigail. The reflection in the mirror twisted, distorting, pulling at its own form like it was trying to break free of the glass. The woman's face stretched again, impossibly wide, as her mouth opened, revealing rows of jagged teeth, sharp and endless. The room seemed to spin as Abigail fought to regain control, her mind reeling. And then, in the corner of her eye, she saw something. A figure, a shadow moving in the distance, just beyond the edges of the room. It was too fast to follow, too dark to fully see, but Abigail felt its presence, a cold, piercing presence. Something else was in the room, something watching her. The woman in front of her stopped moving, suddenly still, her eyes narrowing in something like recognition, or was it hunger? She tilted her head again, just as the figure in the shadows lunged. Abigail didn't have time to react. The figure was upon her before she could scream. It was like a blur of darkness, like something from the deepest corners of hell, wrapping around her, suffocating her, consuming her. And then, everything went black. Part 4. The Black Veil. Abigail awoke to silence. A heavy, oppressive silence that felt like a living thing. Her body was cold, her limbs stiff, as if she had been lying there for hours, days, maybe. The air was thick with dust and something else, something foul. The scent of damp wood, decaying fabric, and an underlying rot that made her stomach turn. She tried to move, but found herself lying on something soft yet wrong. Not a bed, not the floor. It was yielding, almost pulsing beneath her touch. She bolted upright, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Darkness surrounded her, vast and endless, like a shroud of ink. But then, something moved. A flicker, a shadow shifting in the black. No, not one. Many. The air itself seemed to pulse, a silent, rhythmic thrum that vibrated in her bones. The sensation was suffocating, as if the walls of the house had collapsed in on her, burying her in an ocean of unseen horrors. A whisper, soft, right against her ear. "You are not alone." Abigail jerked around, her hands clutching at the darkness, but there was no one there. Only the ever-present black, pressing in on all sides. Then, a dim light flickered to life, a sickly, yellow glow from a candle at the far end of the room. It wasn't enough to chase away the darkness, only enough to reveal something worse. The walls. They weren't made of wood anymore. They weren't even walls. They pulsed like living flesh. Veins crawled beneath the surface, thick and twisting, glowing faintly with an eerie blue luminescence. The floor beneath her shifted as if breathing, and the air smelled metallic, like blood. Abigail stumbled back, her hands trembling. "Where am I?" Then she heard it again. The whisper. But this time, it wasn't in her ear. It was inside her mind. "You belong to the house now." The voice was layered, as if hundreds of mouths were speaking at once. Some pleading, some laughing, others wailing in torment. Abigail pressed her hands to her ears, but the voices didn't stop. She forced herself to move, stepping toward the candle's dim light. Every step felt wrong, like she was walking through something that didn't want her there. The flesh beneath her feet gave slightly, like old, decayed muscle. Then she saw them. Figures. Dozens, no, hundreds of them. They were suspended in the walls, barely visible beneath the translucent, pulsing surface. Faces stretched and contorted in agony, their mouths open in silent screams. Their eyes were hollow, empty voids, yet Abigail could feel them watching her, pleading with her. One of them looked just like her. She stumbled backward, her pulse hammering in her chest. No, no, this isn't real. This isn't real. A guttural, rasping breath filled the space behind her. Cold, wet, rotten. She didn't want to turn around. She had to. The moment her gaze shifted, she felt her sanity unravel. The figure stood just inches from her, its form shifting, undulating as if it were barely holding itself together. Its face was a warped reflection of her own, stretched and twisted beyond human limits. Its mouth hung open, an abyss of writhing, black tendrils. Its eyes. They weren't eyes. They were pits of absolute darkness, voids that pulled at her, threatening to consume her. And then it spoke. "Welcome home, Abigail." The voice was hers, but broken, warped, like it had been twisted by years of suffering, of torment beyond comprehension. She screamed, a soundless, suffocated scream as the shadows swallowed her whole. Darkness, pain. The house had her now, and it would never let go. Chapter 3. The Hollow Ones. Part 1. A door that should not exist. There was no air, no light, no sense of time, only silence. Abigail existed in the dark, floating in a vast, endless void. Her body felt weightless, her thoughts fragmented, like shattered glass drifting through an abyss. She didn't know how long she had been here. Minutes? Hours? A lifetime? Then, she felt something. A presence. Watching. Waiting. It wasn't the house. It was older. Hungrier. A sudden force yanked at her, pulling her downward. The void shrank around her, compressing, suffocating, until, without warning, she fell. Thud. She hit solid ground, hard. The impact knocked the air from her lungs, sending pain splintering through her ribs. The cold bit into her skin as she gasped, rolling onto her side. She wasn't in the void anymore. She was somewhere worse. The room was unfamiliar. Or was it? The walls were lined with rotting wallpaper, peeling in long, jagged strips. A faint, flickering glow from an unseen source barely illuminated the space, casting shadows that moved when they shouldn't. The floor was wooden, but warped, as though something beneath it had been pressing upward, trying to escape. A door stood at the far end of the room. It was ancient, carved from dark, almost blackened wood. Symbols had been etched deep into its surface, spiraling and twisting in patterns Abigail didn't recognize, but they felt wrong. Her pulse quickened. This door, it should not exist. She had seen it before, but not in waking life. In her nightmares, the whispers returned. Do not open it. You cannot escape. She is waiting. Abigail's breath hitched, her eyes flicking toward the shadows curling in the corners of the room. Shapes writhed within them, shifting, almost forming into something human, but not quite. She had two choices: stay here and wait for whatever was watching her to step out of the dark, or open the door. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the handle, the symbols on the wood seeming to pulse under her gaze. Her skin prickled with a warning, her instinct screaming at her to stop, but something on the other side was pulling her toward it. She turned the handle. The door swung open without resistance. Beyond it was nothing but blackness, a blackness that breathed. And then, something moved inside it. A hand shot out of the darkness, too long, too thin, bones pressing against stretched, sickly gray skin, fingernails like splintered claws. It grasped Abigail's wrist before she could pull away. Cold, so cold. Pain shot through her arm as the thing's grip tightened, its fingers digging into her flesh. Abigail screamed, yanking backward, but it was too strong. Then, from within the dark, a voice spoke. I have been waiting for you. Part 2, Beneath the House. The darkness swallowed Abigail whole. For a moment, there was only the sensation of falling. Not through air, but through something thicker, like ink or tar. It clung to her skin, wrapped around her throat, crawled into her mouth as if trying to pull her apart from the inside. Then, impact. She hit solid ground again, her knees scraping against rough stone. The cold bit into her bones, and a thick, rotten smell filled her lungs. Damp earth, old blood, and something worse. This wasn't the house anymore. It was beneath it. She forced herself to stand, her legs shaking. The darkness pressed in from all sides, broken only by faint, flickering lights embedded into the stone walls. Not torches, not candles, but something else. Something unnatural. Then she saw them. Figures. Dozens of them, lining the walls like statues. They weren't moving. They weren't breathing. Their faces were twisted in silent agony, mouths stretched open in eternal screams. Their eyes, if they had any, were nothing but hollow voids, blacker than the abyss itself. The whispering returned. They are waiting. They are hungry. You should not be here. Abigail's pulse pounded in her ears. And then, one of the figures moved. A slow, shuddering breath escaped its throat. Its head turned toward her in a series of sharp, unnatural jerks. Its mouth twitched and then, it grinned. Not with teeth. With something else. Something inside its mouth. Something moving. Abigail took a step back, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The figure took a step forward. Then another. The others began to stir, their hollow eyes locked onto her. A sound filled the cavern. Not whispers anymore. Laughter. Not from them. From something else. Something in the darkness behind her. A voice, smooth as silk and sharp as glass, whispered into her ear. Run. She did. She didn't think. Didn't look back. She just ran. The ground sloped downward, deeper into the earth. The walls pulsed, like something alive. The laughter followed, growing louder, becoming something else. A chorus of voices, layered on top of each other, voices she recognized. Her own voice, her mother's voice, her father's, all of them whispering things she had never said. The passage twisted and turned, the air thickening with a suffocating heat. The sound of footsteps followed her, too many footsteps. She could hear them crawling, hands scraping against stone, breaths, ragged, hungry, too close. And then, a door. Another one, just like the first. She had no choice. Abigail lunged for the handle, her fingers barely grazing the wood before something grabbed her ankle. It pulled. Hard. She hit the ground. The breath knocked from her lungs. Fingers, too many fingers, wrapped around her leg, pulling her backward, dragging her toward the massive shadows reaching for her. She kicked, screamed, dug her nails into the ground. The door swung open. A hand shot out, human, warm, alive. It grabbed her wrist, yanked her forward, and the world blinked. The darkness vanished. The whispers stopped. The scent of rot and earth was gone. Abigail found herself back in the house, back in the same room where it had all started. The mirror was there, the bed, the peeling wallpaper, everything exactly the same. Except for one thing. She wasn't alone. A man stood in the corner of the room, tall, dressed in black. His face was pale, his features sharp, but his eyes were hollow. Not empty, hollow. And when he spoke, his voice was the same voice that had told her to run. Abigail, you let them see you. Part 3. The Man in Black. Abigail couldn't move. Her body refused to listen, as if the weight of what she had just escaped was still pressing down on her. The man in black watched her with those hollow eyes. Not empty, not blind, but wrong. He took a step forward. She flinched. He stopped, tilted his head. You let them see you, he repeated, his voice calm, almost disappointed. Abigail's breath came in shallow gasps. Who are you? A long silence. Then, someone who keeps the door closed. She swallowed. What were they? Another pause. Then, the man smiled. Not a warm smile. Not even a cruel one. Just a smile. Hollow. The words sent a shiver down her spine. She glanced at the door, wondering if she could run, if she should scream. But something inside her knew. It wouldn't matter. What do they want? She whispered. The man's smile faded. For the first time, his expression shifted. Something close to pity. They want what they lost. Abigail's stomach twisted. And what did they lose? His eyes darkened. The same thing you're about to. Her pulse pounded in her skull. Then, without warning, the mirror shattered. Glass exploded outward, but there was no reflection underneath. No wooden back panel. No wall. Only darkness. And in that darkness, something moved. The whispering returned, this time from inside the broken mirror. She's here. She's ours. We can take her now. Cold fingers brushed against Abigail's arm. She screamed, stumbling back, crashing into the man in black. But when she turned to push him away, he wasn't there. He had never been there. The door behind her slammed shut. And then, hands, so many hands, reached out from the broken glass, clawing their way toward her, their hollow eyes wide, their mouths still smiling. And they pulled her in. The last thing Abigail heard before the darkness swallowed her whole was her own voice, whispering back at her. You should not have looked. Chapter 4. The Mirror's Curse. Part 1. Through the Glass. Abigail hit the ground hard. Or at least, she thought she did. There was no floor beneath her, only a sensation of falling. A slow, endless descent through something thicker than air but colder than ice. Her stomach twisted, her lungs burned. The voices from the broken mirror whispered all around her, brushing against her skin like cobwebs. You let us in. You let yourself in. Abigail's arms flailed, searching for something, anything, to hold on to. But there was nothing, just darkness. And then, a sudden stop. She didn't crash. She didn't hit anything. She just stopped moving, as though something had caught her in invisible hands and placed her down gently. The whispers ceased. She blinked. The darkness around her peeled away like smoke retreating from fire, revealing something impossibly familiar. Her room. The same peeling wallpaper. The same dusty windows. The same cracked mirror. Had it all been a dream? Abigail's pulse hammered in her ears. Slowly, she stepped forward, her bare feet brushing against the cold wooden floor. The door stood slightly open, a sliver of the hallway visible beyond. She reached for it, and then she saw it. In the mirror. Not her reflection. Not exactly. It looked like her, but the eyes were wrong. Too dark. Too empty. The mirror version of Abigail didn't move the same way she did. It lagged, as though reality itself struggled to keep up with the illusion. Abigail took a step closer to the glass. So did the reflection. But the lag was worse now. A full second behind. Abigail's breath hitched. She raised her hand. Her reflection did the same. Late. Abigail reached forward. So did the reflection. But this time, it smiled. She hadn't. The wrong Abigail's lips curled upward into a slow, unnatural grin. A grin that stretched too far, revealing teeth that were too sharp. Abigail stumbled back, her pulse racing. The reflection tilted its head. Then, in a voice that was hers but wasn't, it whispered. We switched places. Abigail's stomach dropped. You're in here now. The wrong Abigail took another step closer to the glass, placing a palm against it. From the other side. And I. The thing smiled wider. I'm out there. The door creaked, and Abigail realized. She wasn't alone in the room. Part 2. The thing in the room. The door creaked open slowly, as if whatever stood beyond it was savoring the moment. Abigail turned, her breath caught in her throat. She saw nothing, just the darkened hallway beyond. But she felt it. A presence. A weight in the air, thick and suffocating. Behind her, the thing in the mirror still grinned, its teeth gleaming like shards of broken glass. Don't turn your back on it. The thought slammed into Abigail's mind like a warning from something deep, instinctual. But her body had already betrayed her. She was facing the open door now, and the moment she turned her back on the mirror, something moved behind her. Not just a flicker of light, not just a shift in shadow. Something stepped out. A breath, rasping, wet, wrong, filled the silence. Abigail didn't turn around. She couldn't. Every nerve in her body screamed that if she did, if she so much as glanced over her shoulder, she would see something she wasn't supposed to see. And once she saw it, it would never let her go. The whisper came again, slithering through the air. I'm out there now. It wasn't coming from the mirror anymore. It was right behind her. Abigail squeezed her eyes shut. She had to move. She had to. Creak. The floorboards groaned behind her as the thing took another step closer. No, it wasn't walking. It was dragging itself toward her. A soft scraping sound, flesh against wood, sent ice through Abigail's veins. Don't look. Don't look. Don't look. But she could feel it, its breath against the back of her neck, the unnatural heat of something that shouldn't exist. Then, a hand brushed her shoulder. And that was it. Abigail screamed and bolted through the door. She didn't care where she was going. She just had to get away. The hallway stretched ahead, impossibly long, doors lining both sides, all closed. No lights, no windows, just endless darkness. Behind her, the thing gave chase. She could hear it, too fast, too heavy, too wrong. The wet dragging sound filled the hallway, a grotesque rhythm of something that had never learned to walk properly. She reached the end of the corridor. A door. She lunged for the handle, locked. No, no, no. The thing was right behind her now. And then, the whispers came again. This way, Abigail. A different voice. From the shadows at the end of the hallway, a door she hadn't seen before opened on its own. Inside, nothing but darkness. But she had no choice. She ran inside, and the door slammed shut behind her. Part 3. The door that shouldn't exist. Silence. Abigail pressed her back against the cold door, her breath coming in frantic gasps. The thing outside, the thing that had crawled out of the mirror, was still there. She could hear it shuffling against the door, its wet, ragged breathing leaking through the cracks. But it wasn't trying to break in. It was waiting. And somehow that was worse. Abigail swallowed hard, forcing herself to focus. The room was pitch black. No windows, no furniture, just a suffocating emptiness stretching in every direction. Except, not quite empty. She could feel something in here with her. Not like the thing outside. This was different. Older. Watching. This way, Abigail. The whisper slithered through the dark, soft as a breath, curling around her ears. Abigail tensed. That voice, she knew that voice. But from where? A small flicker of light bloomed ahead. A candle, weak and trembling, barely illuminating the space around it. And then she saw her. A woman stood in the candlelight, draped in shadows. Her hair hung in tangled strands around her face, her skin pale, her eyes hollow, dark. But the worst part? She looked just like Abigail. Not a reflection, not a ghost. Her. Abigail's breath hitched. The woman raised a single, trembling hand and pointed. "It's coming for you." Abigail's stomach twisted. She didn't know if the woman was warning her or threatening her. And before she could ask, a loud, deafening crash came from behind. The door buckled. The thing outside wasn't waiting anymore. It was coming in, and Abigail was out of time. Part 4. The Shattered Path. The door splintered behind her. Abigail barely had time to react before a wet, slithering hand forced its way through the cracks. The thing outside, the thing that had been waiting, was breaking in. She turned to run, but the woman in the candlelight, her other self, hadn't moved. She was still standing there, watching, her hollow eyes locked onto Abigail's. "You don't have much time," the woman whispered. Abigail's pulse pounded. The walls around her shifted. The floor shuddered. The candlelight flickered, stretching shadows in unnatural directions. And then, a door appeared. Not the one she had entered through. This one was different. Old, warped, covered in carvings that twisted and writhed as though alive. Abigail didn't trust it, but the thing behind her let out a guttural screech, shoving its entire arm through the cracked door, its fingers splitting into jagged, writhing tendrils. There was no choice. She ran. Her fingers closed around the handle of the impossible door. It burned. Not hot, cold. A soul-freezing, marrow-deep cold that sent pain lancing up her arm. But she turned it anyway. The door swung open, and Abigail fell forward into nothing. A void. A chasm of darkness. And as she plunged into the abyss, the last thing she heard was the whisper of her own voice. "You were never supposed to leave." Chapter 5. The Final Reflection. Part 1. The Endless Fall. Abigail plunged into darkness. The cold wrapped around her like a second skin, thick and suffocating. She couldn't see. She couldn't breathe. There was no ground, no sky, only an endless void swallowing her whole. Then, a mirror. It materialized in front of her, floating in the abyss. But this wasn't a normal mirror. It was shattered. Each broken shard reflected a different version of herself, some familiar, some twisted beyond recognition. One Abigail stood lifeless, her face blank. Another Abigail screamed, her mouth stretching impossibly wide. A third stared back with hollow eyes, her body flickering like a dying flame. And then she saw her, the woman from the candlelit room. "There's no escape," the reflection whispered. Abigail fought to breathe, to move, to wake up. But the mirror was pulling her in, absorbing her. She felt her skin burning, her mind unraveling. And then, she hit the ground. Part 2. The House Remembers. Abigail gasped, her body slamming into cold, wooden floorboards. She was back. The house stretched around her, warped, rotting, endless. But something was wrong. The air was thicker. The walls pulsed, as if the house itself were alive. Shadows slithered across the floor, whispering in voices she didn't recognize. And then, footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming from the darkness. A figure stepped forward. Abigail's breath caught. It was her, the reflection, the other Abigail. But this time, she wasn't just a twisted copy. She was whole, real, standing right in front of her. "You took too long," the other Abigail said, her voice calm, final. Abigail staggered back. What are you?" she choked out. The other Abigail smiled, cold and knowing. "I'm you." Then she stepped forward, and Abigail felt it, a force pulling at her, dragging her backwards. She turned and saw the mirror, whole again, a perfect, pristine reflection. But the reflection wasn't copying her movements anymore. It was reaching for her. No. Abigail fought, but the force was too strong. The mirror rippled like water as her body was pulled inside. The last thing she saw was the other Abigail, stepping away, free. And then, the glass sealed shut, trapping Abigail inside. Part 3. The Curse Lives On. The house was silent. The other Abigail, the real one now, stood before the mirror, running her hands over its smooth surface. A faint shadow flickered within. A face. Abigail's face. Her mouth open in a silent scream, her hands pounding against the glass, forever trapped on the other side. The new Abigail smiled. She turned away from the mirror, stepping toward the door. The house was waiting, and outside, the world awaited her return. But she wasn't Abigail anymore. She was something else, and she was finally free.